And moving across the aisle for the final time to Joshua Shortman, our third speaker for the opposition. Josh is a second-year undergraduate student studying law at Gonville and Caius and a press officer of the Cambridge Union. His main hobby is being rejected for debate audition speeches, but tonight he was accepted and is here to close the case for the proposition. So Josh, you have the ears of the House.
I would just like to start with a minor correction, if I may. I do study history and politics. I'm very proud of the fact. Right, hello everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. In the context of these massive cameras from Channel 4 and the creaking balcony above, this is probably going to sound quite foolish, but when I first saw this motion on the term card, I thought to myself, I probably won't bother going to that one. I tend to come to most of the debates here, and after a while, they begin to give you this dreadful sense of ennui. Because I think this is perhaps because very commonly, the swing vote rarely exceeds more than 10%. Most people walk out through the same doors that they walked in on. And tonight, we're standing in a free speech society, which has bravely declared that this House believes in free speech. And I thought, why bother? They haven't managed to get any opposition speakers, and we all know how the free speech argument goes. We can all imagine the argument for the right to offend. As evidenced by the fact that people like Piers Morgan keep making it all the time, it is a very easy argument to make. Worst of all, if you try and disagree with it, they will start quoting Voltaire and scrambling over each other's feet so that they might die for your right to disagree with them. I think the way that the argument for the freedom of speech is all too often portrayed, and I think we have seen part of this tonight, is sort of like the Statue of Liberty. It's portrayed as a statue of absolute principles that's extremely inspiring to a lot of people and that probably has an American accent. It's also very hard to actually push over. So I thought it might be better to start by pointing out some of the rust. I think the first way to try and sort of make the freedom of speech look less grand, in a way, is if you open a magazine like The Spectator. And this was particularly relevant to the debate before The Spectator columnist pulled out. But I've decided to keep it. My grandfather, who's hopefully watching tonight, very kindly brought me a subscription to The Spectator when lockdown first begun, I think in an attempt to sort of halt my descent into languorous decadence. And so I've ended up reading quite a lot of it. The Spectator views itself in pretty statuesque terms. It describes itself on its website as the best written and most influential weekly in the English language, with writers who have no party line, only an allegiance to clarity of thought, elegance of expression, and independence of opinion. Now, in reality, well, there were some very nice bits about poetry. It felt like cracking open the door to a boardroom, peeking your unfortunate head through the opening, and being immediately assaulted by a room full of 50-year-old men, every one of them trying to show off to you that they're the most sarcastic, splenetic, witty, and self-inflated writer in the building, with Jeremy Clarkson sat in the corner, crying into a bottle of wine. Everyone was shouting, and almost all of them were shouting about how gruesomely offensive it was that they'd been asked to stop shouting. So this is the image I want you to hold in your head when you hear the proposition describing how brilliant the right to offend is. Often, unsurprisingly, rather than resulting in a sort of enlightenment discourse, it simply results in an offended babble. Another great example of this is Katie Hopkins. She came to this union a few years ago, amidst much student protest, not unlike tonight. And she stood here and she talked about how great freedoms of speech were. Yes? Yeah, hello.
I completely agree with you with the shallowness of right-wing free speech argument. But my worry is, don't you think that by rejecting this motion, and by rejecting free speech, you're playing into the trap? This sense of sanctimonious censorious that is held that can only be substantiated if we shy away from these claims. And that don't think declaring that we do not have a right to offend, play directly into the trap we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a very good point, well made. I will get onto that. At the moment, I'm going to focus on just trying to make the freedom of speech seem less brilliant, but I think I do address that later on. So Katie was here in the union, standing where I am now, and she talked about how great it was that we'd come in to eloquently disagree with her to her face and use our freedoms of speech. Then someone stood up and disagreed with her, and her response was to make fun of his stutter and tell him that he looked like a nerd. Now, I think my point here is that all too often, rather than facilitating sparkling discourse, the right to offend gets in the way of it. And once you consider that, perhaps it isn't so unreasonable to introduce rules, or at the very least guidelines, which do curb this right to offend. Yeah.
First of all, I don't believe everyone is Katie Hopkins. Not everyone
Sure.
really make fun of someone's subject, but more importantly, just as the third speaker argued, who are the people who are going to make the rules? Surely it's going to be the government and the elite. And And we need an answer from the opposition why the government should be the one making the rules, or why, because they're the ones that are likely to make them. Because it is fundamentally a right, and rights are within legislation, so it has to be government. So we have to prove why it's right.
Yep, I take that. I think, first of all, I want to talk about platforming. I will get to the absolute right in the governmental sense at the very end. So what I was saying is that sometimes I think it's reasonable to have rules, and I haven't said so far the government, I've just said within context. And I think a perfect example is where we are tonight, this institution. We've each got 10 minutes. There are some very strict rules about interrupting, and if we disobey them, David has a very big bell. What we're doing here is we're working off the understanding that communication actually works best when there are ways to prevent people from offending each other. Now, if I were from The Spectator, I doubt I would agree with that. Probably I would say that we shouldn't need rules to protect us, that the boy with the stutter should have stood right back up and called Katie an idiot, should have jumped back into the fray. Or perhaps, if I were a particularly good columnist from The Spectator, I might point out that in a roundabout way, the right to offend actually worked quite well, because it gave Katie enough rope to spell out the word hypocrite. And were I from The Spectator, no doubt I would say that this is the brilliance of the freedom of speech and the right to offend, that in the searing eye of the public gaze, freedom of speech, like water, washes away the rhetoric and shows us the truth. Well, here I would say that the statue is crumbling. This is an old philosophical hope that goes all the way back to the Greeks. It's the hope that discussion leads to truth. But Plato points this out in his critique of the sophists. Rhetoric is often the best way to obscure truth. Exhibit A, I would say, is politicians, especially the ones that bang on the most about freedom of speech. If you turn on any news channel, you'll see the same thing. Not two people trying to achieve truth together, but an interviewer asking questions and a politician just repeating the same slogan. Now, Trump, Putin, Boris, and a few others have perfected this tactic into a noted academic phenomenon. It's called firehosing. It's where you repeat an outrageous lie, the more offensive the better, and then wait for responsible news sources to pick up on it. Usually, first of all, they report what's happened, then they say that it might be a lie, then they finally admit that it is. And by that point, they've repeated it so much that if you do a poll, more people remember the lie than they do the truth. So the truth is that in the free market of ideas, those who shout loudest tend to win. And that's not all. Some of them get given megaphones. Now, I don't think that the freedom of speech is a right-wing idea. However, I do think that the most absolute defences are often right-wing. And I think it shares an irony with lots of right-wing opinions, which is that they work best from an assumption of absolute equality. As has already been pointed out tonight, if we were all standing in a field right now, it's sort of in the state of nature, then this would all be a lot easier. But we're not. We're stood in the Cambridge Union. And in case any of you are still under the illusion that we're stood in the free marketplace of ideas, I had to pay £180 just to give this speech tonight. And I understand they've put the membership up since I joined, so apologies to all of you who presumably had to pay at least that much just to hear it. We're all members of a very expensive free speech society. And that means that my speech right now is not worth the same as someone shouting in a field. Because for a start, hopefully all of you are listening to it. And then at least a few hundred people watched on YouTube, if not indeed Channel 4. So this is what I want you to hold in your heads when we hear proposition arguments about how good the right to offend is. The right to offend all too often gets in the way of discourse. It causes offence by triumphing over reason. And we should recognise that when the people using it are claiming to be using their free speech, they are very rarely speaking from platforms that are free. Now, to address both the POIs and to get to the conclusion of my speech, you might be witnessing me falling on a sword of my own hubris at this point. But if you've been following my arguments, you will realise, as I have, this still doesn't amount to a proper opposition. At no point have I said we should abolish the right to offend. In fact, I have at points been not a little offensive myself towards such august institutions as The Spectator and Piers Morgan. Now, please don't tell the proposition this, but that's because within limits I agree with them. What's more, I'm assuming most of you do as well. I think that's what's emerged out of this debate. Most people here seem basically happy with freedom of speech. Obviously, it would be incredibly frustrating if someone locked me up for making fun of The Spectator. But the thing is, as I said at the very start, I think making that argument is simply incredibly boring. Were we in communist Russia or Iran or China or some of the other places that have been mentioned tonight, I would certainly want you all to walk out of the proposition door. However, if I may remind you for one final time, tonight we are in the Cambridge Union. Nobody is going to be locked away or sent to the gulag. Freedom of speech and the freedom to offend is a pretty great thing to have if you're living under Stalin. But once you've got it, it promises very little more than a shouting boardroom. And if you walk out the proposition door today, I would argue you're actually, contextually, saying tremendously little. You're reaffirming that a free speech society believes in the right to free speech. And my main point is that I think the last thing we need right now is more people shouting about how great free speech is. Because I think the debates here in the UK and in the Cambridge Union is simply far more nuanced than those who believe in free speech on one side and those that don't on the other. And yet it keeps being portrayed like this. Now, I think that's what happened with the Helen Joyce controversy. The protesters, the masters, and I've spoken to both of them, they weren't saying Helen Joyce should be locked up for what she's said. They weren't saying she shouldn't have a right to say anything at all. They were saying that they didn't want her to talk here, that this is a place for people to live, that it's a community rather than an academic paper, and that often the best academic discussions happen when we aren't offended anyway. As has already been said, surprisingly, by the proposition tonight, just because there is a right to offend doesn't mean it needs to be exercised. And I think we're witnessing the same oversimplification of the debate tonight. The Union has identified this debate as being between those that believe in the right to offend and those that don't. And I think every single one of us in our arguments have pointed out that neither of us really weds ourselves to either of those extreme positions. So when I ask you to vote against the House tonight and to disagree with the motion, I mean that very literally. Even if, like me, you do believe in the basic right to cause offence without being locked up, don't just trot out the proposition door like you're supposed to. Take the chance to disagree with the very motion itself. Because the fact we're bound by this motion proves one of my main points tonight. Speech is not, and it can never be, free. Institutions like the Union, the media, and even my college have a great deal of influence. And it's time to examine that rather than continuing to shout about the merits of free speech or pretending that those who criticise it want to abolish it.
On that point.
Yeah.
The reason for which the first opposition speaker laboriously said each time the legislation of England and Wales is because in our neighbour to the north, they do not have the same freedoms as we have here. And so when you claim that everyone in the UK has the right to say whatever they want, that's not actually the case. And
Okay, I can't speak to the intricacies of Scottish legislature myself, but I suppose I'm particularly trying to talk to what's happened recently in Cambridge, and I don't think, as I've said, I don't think it's a debate between people who want to get rid of free speech here. I think that the debate that we should be having tonight is not so absolutist. What I think, in fact, is that what we're witnessing tonight is this union trying to crown itself and turn itself into the Statue of Liberty that I talked about earlier, so that all the world may marvel at what a great thing freedom of speech is. And to that I would say that you should stick out your foot, that you should trip up the king as he walks up the aisle of his own coronation, walk up to Voltaire as he stands shaking on the platform and tap him on the shoulder. Tell him that it's okay, that he doesn't have to jump and that no one's even asking him to. For you and I, freedom of speech is no longer a life or death matter, and I don't think it is even really the question at hand anymore. Reject this tired debate and walk out the opposition door tonight. Thank you.